Today's case takes us to Lorton, a small town in Fairfax County, Virginia, about 20 miles from Washington, D.C. Rows of townhouses line the streets. Lawns are neatly trimmed, and the community is made up of government employees, military personnel, and immigrant families. For years, Fairfax had ranked among the safest counties in the United States. But on the night of April 17, 2024, that sense of peace was shattered. A 38-year-old woman, a mother of two, died after doctors spent hours trying to save her. And in a cruel twist, the man who brought her to the hospital, the man who spoke to police in an apparent state of panic, was the very man who'd been living with her for nearly a year. And before the case was over, prosecutors would count more than 400 lies told by that man. First, let's learn about the victim. Her name was Alison Kate LaPorta, though her family and friends simply called her Kate. She was born on July 11, 1985, the daughter of Timothy Wayne Poundsbury and Margaret Mary LaPorta. Kate's life had never been an easy road. She became a mother at a relatively young age, shortly after finishing high school. She had two children. Her oldest, a daughter named Caitlin Lasky, was already an adult and living on her own by the time this story unfolded. Her younger son, Connor Garvey, had just turned 10 that year. To support her two children, Kate went to work at Safeway, a supermarket chain familiar to millions of Americans. She started at the very bottom, working as a cashier at the Fort Hunt location in Alexandria. But Kate didn't stay there. She remained with the company for more than 6 years, steadily working her way up, one step at a time, until she became a manager. To her friends and co-workers, Kate was cheerful, playful, and the kind of person who seemed to be friends with everyone. Her greatest joy had always been her two children, and one of the things she loved most was taking them to the family home in Bethany, Delaware, where they could all spend time together by the ocean. She also had a habit that everyone in the family knew well. She would regularly text or call each of her loved ones, not because it was a birthday or a holiday, not because there was any special occasion at all, but simply to tell them that she loved them. Now, let's talk about the man. His name was Huy Tien Nguyen, but the people around him called him by a shorter, more American-sounding name, Max, and that's the name I'll use throughout this story. At the time of the case, he was 47 years old, lived in Lorton, and was of Vietnamese descent. According to records connected to the case, Max was described as belonging to a generation that left Vietnam at a young age and grew up within American society. Yet he was very different from the familiar image of many Vietnamese American families in Fairfax County, families who were often active in their communities, connected with other Vietnamese Americans, attending church, or taking part in cultural organizations. Max, by contrast, was almost completely unknown. He kept to himself. He lived quietly. And he seemed somewhat isolated, staying on the sidelines of community life and leaving little impression on the people around him. His legal record, however, was completely clean. No criminal history, no prior record. The only portrait he left of himself could be found in the bio on his personal Facebook page, where he described himself as a vindictive man willing to destroy anyone who tried to harm his family, his friends, or his country. He was almost invisible within his community, yet the image he chose to paint of himself was written in the language of violence. So how did two people who seemed to have almost nothing in common end up together? I have to be honest with you. Even after looking through court records, local news reports, and accounts from family members, I couldn't find a single source that explains where they met or how they first came into each other's lives. The only thing we know for certain is the timeline. They began dating sometime around the beginning of 2023, roughly a year before that fateful night, and pay close attention to where Kate was in her life at the time. In 2022, she'd gone through a severe mental health crisis, serious enough that she had to be hospitalized for treatment. But she managed to get back on her feet. In other words, this man entered Kate's life at a moment when she was both at her most vulnerable and at the same time filled with hope for what might come next. The relationship moved quickly from there. Within just a year, the two had moved in together in a townhouse in Lorton. Throughout that entire year, Fairfax County Police never received a single call or report involving domestic violence inside that home. There was, however, one detail worth noting. Max taught Kate how to assemble firearms. He didn't simply teach her how to shoot them, he also showed her how to put them together herself. According to Jessica Harris, someone who was very close to Kate, Kate seemed genuinely excited about it. To her, perhaps it was nothing more than a shared hobby, another way for the two of them to feel closer to one another. In the United States, it isn't particularly unusual for a man to teach his girlfriend how to shoot, or even how to assemble a firearm at home. For some couples, it can even be seen as a bonding activity, something they do together before heading to the shooting range on the weekend. But behind the closed doors of that townhouse in Lorton, there was something else that no one in Kate's family knew. The man she was living with had been abusing her. It wasn't until the night of April 17th that the people who loved Kate most finally learned the truth. For an entire year, she'd kept it hidden in silence. Now, let's go back to the night of April 17th, 2024. It was a Wednesday. That evening, Kate and Max went together to Revolution Darts and Billiards, a darts and pool hall in Fairfax County, the kind of place that's very common in the area. Amid the loud music and the sharp clack of billiard balls, a heated argument erupted between them, and it became so intense that people nearby couldn't help but notice. At the surrounding tables, there were men who clearly heard the words coming directly from Max that night. One of them heard him say something along the lines of, "This argument can only end with a bullet." Another heard him add, "I'm going to shoot this girl." At that moment, inside a crowded pool hall, the people who heard those words probably assumed they were nothing more than angry threats blurted out by a rough-tempered man during a fight with his girlfriend. No one called the police, and no one stepped in. After leaving the bar, the two got into their car. On the drive home, inside the cramped, suffocating space of the closed vehicle, things continued to escalate. We know this because of the messages Kate secretly sent to someone close to her, someone she considered like a sister. In those messages, Kate said she was terrified, that she was afraid of her own partner. But then, almost immediately afterward, she wrote something that's difficult to read without stopping for a moment. She said, "He's just confused, and it's not his fault." Then she added that she herself didn't know what to do anymore. The family members on the other end immediately urged her to call the police. But Kate didn't. Then, at 10:21 p.m., she sent the most alarming message of all. In it, she wrote that he'd fired a gun several times right next to her head. And in another message that same night, Kate wrote a sentence that no one in her family would later be able to read without breaking down. "This man is going to kill me." That message left Kate's entire family deeply worried. They tried repeatedly to contact her, but they couldn't reach her. That was when they immediately split up and began searching for her. At 11:35 p.m. on April 17th, a vehicle sped into the emergency drop-off area at Inova Mount Vernon Hospital on Parker's Lane in the Hybla Valley area. A man got out carrying Kate LaPorta in his arms. She was unresponsive, with a gunshot wound to her upper body. Doctors and nurses immediately began a desperate race against death, and Kate was soon rushed to Inova Fairfax Hospital for further emergency treatment. For a short period of time, the entire building was placed on lockdown, with only emergency personnel allowed to enter or leave, because at that point, no one knew whether an armed shooter might still be somewhere outside. At the same time, Fairfax County Police arrived at the hospital. In the waiting area, an officer approached the Vietnamese American man and began taking his statement. The entire interaction was captured on the officer's body camera. In the footage, Max can be seen slowly raising both hands and his arms as instructed, so officers could check him for weapons. His hands were covered in blood. Then he began telling his story. Looking shocked and panicked, he said the woman being treated inside was his girlfriend. He claimed that earlier that night, the two of them had been walking through a parking lot in the Annandale area when they suddenly heard gunshots coming from somewhere nearby. In an instant, Kate collapsed. He insisted that he hadn't seen the shooter and had no idea what had happened. According to him, she'd been struck by a stray bullet during a random shooting, and the two of them had simply been unfortunate bystanders passing through. He said he'd been so panicked that he didn't have time to call 911. All he could do was pick up his girlfriend, put her in the car, and drive straight to the hospital. That was story number 1. But inside the emergency room, despite every effort the doctors made, Alison Kate LaPorta couldn't be saved, and the official investigation began. At this point, I want to stop for a moment and talk about an important principle in crime scene investigation. A shooting that happens outdoors creates an open crime scene. Shell casings can scatter far away, blood can be washed away by rain, and the shot itself could have come from dozens of different directions. Reconstructing what happened can be extremely difficult, but a gunshot fired inside a vehicle is different. In that moment, the car becomes a sealed box, preserving every shell casing, every blood stain, every bullet hole, every trace of gunshot residue, exactly where it was left. In forensic science, people often say that this is the kind of crime scene that doesn't lie, because it records exactly where each person was sitting, and who shot whom. And the car sitting outside the entrance to the emergency department had already begun telling a story completely different from the one Max had just told. When investigators from the Fairfax County Police Department's homicide unit examined the vehicle, they discovered blood inside the passenger compartment. There was also evidence of bullet impact on the seat. In other words, the fatal shot had clearly been fired from inside the vehicle, not from somewhere outside. At the same time, investigators quickly established something else. According to Max, the shooting had happened in a parking lot in the Annandale area. It was true that the two had been in Annandale that night, but they'd gone there to visit the pool hall. The parking lot Max described was a place they'd never even been to, so the entire setting of his first story, from beginning to end, simply did not exist. There was another detail that caught the investigators' attention. If this really had been an attack by a stranger, then one of the most logical motives would have been robbery. But inside Kate's purse, her wallet and phone were still there, untouched. There was no sign that anyone had searched through her belongings or taken anything. By this point, Fairfax County Police had enough evidence to completely reject Max's original statement. They determined that Max was the person who had shot Kate LaPorta inside the vehicle and only afterward drove her to the hospital. That same night, he was arrested at the hospital and taken to the Fairfax County Adult Detention Center. He was charged with second-degree murder and use of a firearm in the commission of a felony. But the story wasn't over yet, because police still had to find one of the most important pieces of evidence of all, the weapon. And they found the gun used in the shooting near the front steps of Max's home in Lorton. It was a CZ-97BD handgun, chambered in .45 caliber. And there's one very simple question to ask. If Kate had really been struck by a stray bullet fired by some unknown shooter in a parking lot, then why was Max's gun hidden near the steps of his own home? And why, while rushing the woman he loved to the hospital, would a man take the time to stop and hide a weapon? The location of the gun alone was enough to tear apart his entire first story. Faced with that evidence, Max withdrew his original account, and then he began telling a second story. During a recorded interrogation at police headquarters, he said that while the two of them were driving home, Kate became agitated. According to Max, she grabbed the gun from the center console between the two seats and fired several shots in his direction, with the bullets flying out through the open window. He claimed that the muzzle flash temporarily blinded him. And when he looked again, he saw Kate holding the gun with both hands, turning it toward herself, and pulling the trigger. That was story number 2. Kate had shot herself. But there was another detail that left investigators with questions. Max never called 911. Instead of asking an ambulance to come to the scene, he put Kate in the car himself and drove her to the hospital. Whatever the real reason behind that decision may have been, it meant that Kate didn't receive emergency medical care at the scene. It also gave Max a period of time alone before he had to face the police. And after the many different versions of his story that would follow, that period of time became an increasingly significant detail in the investigation. Now, let's look at what the forensic evidence had to say. The first thing investigators found inside the car was the spent shell casings, and where they were located was especially important. 4 shell casings were found on the driver's side, the side of the person behind the wheel, not on the passenger side where Kate had been sitting. Another shell casing was found inside Kate's purse. The fatal bullet itself was recovered from the back seat. But the most powerful piece of evidence, and the one that would later be mentioned more than almost any other whenever people discussed this case, was a photograph. It was a photograph of Kate's seat belt, and on it was an impression matching the shape of the gun itself. Think about what that detail means. For an impression like that to be left on the seatbelt, the gun had to have been pressed firmly against Kate's body at the moment it was fired, and it had to have been pressed toward her from the driver's side, from the person sitting beside her. If someone were holding a gun in both hands and turning it toward their own abdomen, as Max had described, the angle of contact and the direction of the pressure would have been completely different. Experts later analyzed the path of the bullet through Kate's body. The results matched what the seatbelt had already revealed, and there was one more detail that made the theory that Kate had held the gun and shot herself even harder to believe. At the time of the shooting, one of her wrists was injured and had to be immobilized in a brace. Now, try to picture the second story this man had just told. According to him, Kate grabbed a .45 caliber handgun, fired several shots in his direction, and then turned the gun on herself. But remember, at the time, one of Kate's wrists was immobilized in a brace. And all of those movements were supposedly taking place inside the cramped confines of a car, while the two of them were struggling with each other. When that account is placed alongside the condition of Kate's wrist and the physical evidence found inside the vehicle, the theory that she shot herself becomes increasingly difficult to reconcile with the evidence as a whole. By this point, the case file was largely complete, and it was turned over to prosecutors in Fairfax County to prepare for trial. Because Max couldn't afford an attorney, the court appointed a public defender to represent him. But if you think that, with this much evidence, the trial would be quick and straightforward, and that this man would simply lower his head and admit what he'd done, you would be mistaken. Nearly a year and a half after that fateful night, in mid-September 2025, Max's trial officially began at the Fairfax County Circuit Court, part of Virginia's state court system. The prosecution was led by the Office of Fairfax County Commonwealth's attorney Steve Descano. Throughout the entire period leading up to the trial, Max remained in custody and was not released on bail. The prosecution entered the courtroom with a case that seemed almost impossible to refute. The evidence appeared to point against Max. The courtroom was completely silent, but the defense had no intention of giving up, and they chose a strategy that, even now, Kate's family still cannot accept when they look back on it. The defense attorney brought into court hundreds of pages of Kate LaPorta's medical records dating back to 2022, 2 years before her death, from the period when she'd suffered a mental health crisis and required hospitalization. A forensic psychology expert was called to analyze those records before the jury and testified that Kate had previously been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type. When questioned by the defense attorney, the expert also confirmed that, in theory, such a condition could place someone at a higher than average risk of taking their own life. That was the defense's entire strategy. They didn't need to prove that Kate had shot herself. They only needed to plant a seed of doubt in the minds of the 12 jurors, that perhaps she could have. I want to make one thing very clear, because this part can easily be misunderstood. Having received treatment for mental health issues is completely normal and says nothing about a person's character. Kate had received treatment and stabilized. 2 years later, she was still going to work regularly, had risen to the position of supermarket manager, and was still caring for her 2 children. The stack of records brought into court was not the record of someone who was falling apart. It was the record of someone who had gotten back on her feet. And yet those records were still used against her, at a time when she was no longer there to defend herself. Then, during the second week of the trial, something very unusual happened. In the American justice system, a defendant has the absolute right to remain silent, and most experienced attorneys advise their clients never to take the witness stand, because once they sit in that chair, they must face cross-examination by the prosecution, and every inconsistency in their story can be exposed in front of the jury. But Max decided to testify anyway, and right there on the witness stand, he admitted that much of what he'd previously told investigators had been lies. He now testified that there had never been any parking lot at all, and that the gunshots had actually been fired while the 2 of them were traveling along Telegraph Road. He also changed his story about the gun. Earlier, he'd told police that Kate had thrown it out of the car. Now, he said that he himself had removed the gun from the vehicle before driving to the hospital. During cross-examination, the prosecutor went through each change in Max's story, step by step. Max said that he'd been exhausted, that he'd been extremely tired from sitting in the interrogation room, and that he simply wanted to find the quickest way to get back to Kate. In other words, his explanation for blaming the dead woman was that he wanted to get out of there sooner. Throughout the investigation and the trial, prosecutors sat down and compared every statement he had made, one by one. And they arrived at a number that drew attention across the United States when the case was reported. The man had lied more than 400 times. For his part, the defense attorney held on to the same final argument until the very end. He argued that the prosecution was relying on inferences that weren't supported by the evidence, and that even at that point, there was still no direct proof that Max's finger was the one that pulled the trigger. And in one sense, he was right, because there had been only 2 people inside that car that night. And this is where we need to understand one legal concept that explains the entire ending of this case. In Virginia, as in most states, murder is divided into different degrees. First-degree murder is the most serious charge, and to secure a conviction at that level, prosecutors must prove that the killing was intentional, calculated, and planned in advance, what the law calls premeditation. Second-degree murder is different. It still involves an intentional killing, where the person fully understands what they're doing and that their actions can cause death, but the act happens in a burst of anger, rather than as part of a plan formed beforehand. In Virginia, the maximum sentence for second-degree murder is 40 years in prison, plus a mandatory 3 years without reduction for using a firearm in the commission of a felony, for a total of 43 years. From the very beginning, prosecutors charged Max with second-degree murder rather than first-degree murder. And that was something Kate's family would struggle with long afterward. Because when people looked at the threat made inside the pool hall, the gun he already had with him, and the series of desperate messages Kate sent asking for help, many wondered whether that was already enough to call the killing premeditated. But under the legal standard required in court, a threat made in the heat of anger is still not enough by itself to establish a planned murder. That was the legal line prosecutors had to weigh very carefully. After hearing all of the evidence and arguments, the 12 jurors entered the deliberation room. They stayed there for nearly 20 hours, stretching across more than 2 days. On September 22, 2025, the final verdict was announced. The jury found Max guilty on both counts, second-degree murder and use of a firearm in the commission of a felony. They didn't believe the suicide story. Not for a moment. After leaving the courtroom, Commonwealth's attorney Steve Descano gave a brief statement that left many people speechless. He said, "Kate should still be here with us today." He said that this man's actions had taken a daughter away from her parents and a mother away from her children. But for Kate's family, the emotions were far more complicated. Tim Poundsbury, Kate's father, spoke to the press immediately after the verdict was read and said that none of this healed anything. That man would go to prison, but it still wouldn't bring his daughter back. The entire family said they were satisfied with the guilty verdict, but at the same time, deeply disappointed that it wasn't a conviction for first-degree murder. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for February of the following year, and throughout the months leading up to it, prosecutors and Kate's family shared the same hope, that the judge would impose the maximum sentence allowed by law. On February 13th, 2026, the sentence was officially handed down. The judge sentenced Max to 23 years in prison. In his victim impact statement read before the court, Tim Poundsbury said that this murder had brought absolute devastation to his family. Later, when speaking to reporters, he repeated one simple sentence, that this man had killed his daughter, and that 23 years, no matter how you looked at it, was not enough. Kate's daughter, Caitlin Lasky, said that her mother's death had affected her so deeply that she could no longer sleep at night, and that her family had lost what felt like everything. What worried her most now was her younger brother, who had been only 10 years old on the day their mother was killed. She said her mother was everything, that she could light up an entire room, and that she always knew how to make people smile. If Max serves his full sentence, he'll be over 70 years old by the time he walks out of prison. Do you remember that detail from the beginning of the video? Kate LaPorta had a habit of regularly texting and calling each of her loved ones, not because of any special occasion, but simply to tell them that she loved them. After she died, her family went back and read through all of those messages. And one person wrote that only now, looking back at all those simple messages of love, sent for no particular reason, did they understand why there had been so many of them in her final days. That person wondered. Maybe, somehow, Kate had known. And finally, remember this detail. Throughout an entire year of living together, Fairfax County Police never received a single call from that house. That's the most painful part of this case, but also the most important lesson it leaves behind. In many abusive relationships, victims don't leave, and they don't report what is happening. Kate saw everything. She simply believed she still had time. In the end, she had none left. If you're hiding injuries or constantly making excuses for someone else's behavior, please take a serious look at what's happening. Violence in a relationship almost never stops after just one incident. And if someone tells you that something similar is happening to them, please don't brush it aside, because that may be the only time they ever find the courage to speak. In Lorton today, Kate's 2 children are still learning to live without their mother. And the man who once described himself as someone willing to destroy anyone who threatened his family ended up destroying the family of the woman who loved him. So what do you think about the 23-year sentence given to Max? Considering everything that happened, was it a punishment that fit the crime, or was it still too lenient in the eyes of Kate's family? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'm Adrian Cole. If you want to keep joining me as we examine real criminal cases and the unanswered questions that remain behind every verdict, hit like and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next story.